July 26, 1974, a young girl walking her dog through the sand dunes of Provincetown, Massachusetts, made a discovery that would haunt investigators for nearly 50 years. Half buried in the sand, covered with a beach blanket and a pair of jeans, lay the mutilated body of a woman. Her hands had been severed, her head had been nearly decapitated, held to her body only by a small piece of skin. Most disturbing of all, someone had removed several of her teeth and crushed her skull with such force that identifying her became nearly impossible. The woman appeared to be in her mid-20s to early 30s, with reddish-brown auburn hair styled in a manner that was expensive and fashionable. Her body showed signs that she'd been a woman who took care of herself. Manicured nails, no signs of hard labor, skin that suggested indoor work rather than outdoor exposure. She wore no jewelry except for what appeared to be expensive gold dental work that had been partially destroyed. Whoever killed her had gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure she could never be identified. The medical examiner determined she'd been dead for at least a week, possibly longer, exposed to the sun and the elements in the isolated dunes. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, delivered with such violence that her skull had been fractured in multiple places. But the removal of her hands and the deliberate destruction of her dental work suggested something more calculated than a crime of passion. Someone wanted this woman to remain nameless forever. What made the case even more bizarre was the positioning of the body. She had been carefully laid out on a beach towel, her body composed with her arms at her sides. The blanket and jeans covering her suggested someone had tried to give her a burial of sorts, or perhaps conceal her from view. But why mutilate her face and hands if you were going to partially cover the body? The contradictions in the crime scene baffled investigators. Police released a facial reconstruction and published her description nationwide. No missing persons reports matched. No one came forward to identify her. It was as if this woman had never existed, as if she'd simply materialized on that beach to die. Over the decades, numerous theories emerged. Some believed she was a victim of organized crime, killed because she knew too much about criminal operations in the area. Provincetown in the 1970s was a resort town that attracted tourists, but it also had an underbelly of drug trafficking and criminal activity. Perhaps she had witnessed something she shouldn't have. Others pointed to the numerous serial killers operating in New England during the 1970s. The calculated mutilation, the removal of identifying features, these matched patterns seen in other serial murders. But no known serial killer ever claimed her a victim, and no similar murders were connected to her case. One of the most intriguing theories involved Hollywood. In 1974, the movie Jaws was being filmed in nearby Martha's Vineyard. Some investigators noted that the woman appeared as an extra in one scene of the movie, a crowd shot that showed a woman with auburn hair wearing clothes similar to what the victim had been wearing. Could she have been someone connected to the film production? But when producers reviewed their records, no one working on the film was reported missing, and the woman in the crowd shot was never definitively identified as the victim. The case went cold for decades, but DNA technology brought new hope. In 2022, using advanced genetic genealogy, the same technique that caught the Golden State Killer, investigators finally identified the Lady of the Dunes as Ruth Marie Terry, a 37-year-old woman from Tennessee who'd been living in California. She had been married to a man who worked in organized crime circles, and her murder occurred during a trip to the East Coast. But identification didn't solve the mystery. It only deepened it. Who killed Ruth Terry? Why was she in Provincetown? What happened in those final hours that led to such brutal violence? And most disturbing of all, why did her own family never report her missing? Her husband was questioned but died before charges could be filed, taking whatever secrets he held to the grave. The dunes where she was found still stand, unchanged by time. Tourists walk through them daily, most unaware that under the sand where they're standing, a woman once lay for weeks, her identity stolen, her life erased, becoming the lady with no name for nearly half a century. In the spring of 1946, as America celebrated the end of World War II, the border town of Texarkana, straddling Texas and Arkansas, became a hunting ground for a sadistic killer who struck only under the full moon. Over 10 terrifying weeks, the Phantom Killer would attack 5 times, leaving 5 dead and a community so paralyzed with fear that parents forbade their children from going outside after dark. Hardware stores sold out of locks and guns, and the town resembled a war zone with armed residents patrolling the streets. The terror began on February 22, 1946, with an attack that seemed almost routine for police. A young couple, parked on a rural lover's lane, were assaulted by a man wearing a white hood over his head with crude eye holes cut out. He beat them both savagely with a blunt instrument, but let them live. At the time, police treated it as a robbery gone wrong, a crime of opportunity. They had no idea they were dealing with something far more sinister. 3 weeks later, on March 24th, the Phantom struck again. But this time, he didn't leave witnesses. Richard Griffin, 29, and Polly Ann Moore, 17, were found shot to death in Griffin's car on a deserted road just outside Texarkana. Both had been shot in the back of the head, execution style, at point-blank range. Polly Ann had been sexually assaulted. The killer had positioned them carefully after death, Griffin slumped behind the wheel, Polly Ann in the back seat, as if arranging a tableau. The community was rattled, but the worst was yet to come. Exactly 3 weeks after the second attack, on April 14th, the pattern became clear and terrifying. Paul Martin, 16, and Betty Jo Booker, 15, disappeared after a date. Paul's body was found the next morning on a highway, shot 4 times. Betty Jo's body was discovered 2 miles away in a ditch, shot twice in the face, and sexually assaulted. She had been playing saxophone in a local band just hours before her death. Texarkana descended into absolute panic. The pattern was unmistakable. Attacks every 3 weeks, targeting young couples, occurring under the full moon. Parents forbade their teenagers from dating. Couples who had been planning weddings postponed them. The town's streets, once bustling with nightlife, became deserted after sunset. Hardware stores sold out of locks, chains, and firearms. Neighbors formed armed patrols. It was said that Texarkana had more loaded guns per capita than any town in America that spring. High school proms were canceled. Drive-in theaters closed. The local economy suffered as people refused to leave their homes after dark. Some families sent their children to live with relatives in other states. The fear was so pervasive that it changed the town's culture permanently. On May 3rd, the Phantom broke his pattern in a way that proved he was escalating. Instead of attacking a couple in a car, he came to a home. Virgil Starks, 37, was reading a newspaper in his farmhouse when bullets suddenly crashed through the window. He died instantly. His wife Katie ran for help, but was shot twice in the face through another window. Miraculously, she survived, running to a neighbor's house despite her injuries. Katie Starks became the only victim to survive and provide a description, though her account was frustratingly vague. She described a man running from the scene, but in the darkness and her injured state, she could provide few details. Police flooded the area, setting up roadblocks, searching every vehicle. They found nothing. Then, as suddenly as the attacks began, they stopped. May 3rd was the last attack. The full moon came again in June, then July, then August. No more murders. The Phantom had vanished as mysteriously as he had appeared. The investigation became one of the largest in Texas history. The FBI sent agents. Texas Rangers descended on the town. Police pursued over 400 suspects. They conducted thousands of interviews. But the Phantom remained a ghost, leaving behind only terror and bodies.
escalating in violence. The psychological profile developed by early criminal profilers described a man who derived satisfaction from the community's fear. He likely lived in or near Texarkana, walking among the terrified residents during the day, perhaps even joining the armed patrols at night, enjoying the chaos he had created. He was probably someone who seemed normal, even helpful, someone neighbors trusted. The case inspired the 1976 horror film The Town That Dreaded Sundown, which, despite taking dramatic liberties, captured the genuine terror that gripped the community. One suspect emerged who seemed promising: Ewell Swinney, a career criminal with a history of violence. His wife, after he beat her, told police that Swinney had confessed to the murders. She described in detail how he'd bragged about killing those kids and described aspects of the crimes that hadn't been released to the public. But her testimony was deemed unreliable. She was an accomplice after the fact, and without physical evidence, prosecutors couldn't build a case. Swinney was eventually imprisoned for car theft, but never charged with the phantom murders. Others pointed to different suspects: a man who committed similar crimes in other states, a troubled veteran suffering from what we now call PTSD, even a possibility that multiple killers were responsible for the different attacks. But none of these theories could be proven.
What makes the Texarkana Moonlight Murders so terrifying isn't just the body count or the brutality. It's the calculated nature of the attacks. The 3-week interval suggested planning, not impulse. The choice of the full moon indicated ritual or symbol. The white hood implied premeditation. He'd made a disguise specifically for these crimes. Most disturbing was the evolution of his tactics. He started by beating victims but leaving them alive. Then he progressed to execution-style murders. Then to sexual assault combined with murder. Finally, he attacked a home, killing a man in his own house. This wasn't a killer who'd committed a crime of passion and fled. This was someone who was experimenting, refining his method, and escalating Texarkana that spring. Even today, some older residents remember that time. Remember the fear of the full moon. Remember checking locks obsessively. Remember the sound of every car engine that passed their house after dark. 78 years later, the case remains officially unsolved. The phantom killer was never caught, never identified, never brought to justice. He simply stopped killing, or, more disturbingly, moved elsewhere and continued under a different name. His Texas crimes never connected to later murders in other places. The white hood he wore has become an iconic symbol in true crime history, representing an unknown evil that terrorized an entire community and got away with it. 5 people died, countless others had their lives destroyed by fear, and a town's innocence was shattered by a killer who struck under the moonlight and vanished into legend. Somewhere, perhaps, the phantom killer lived out his life, died of old age, took his secrets to the grave. Or perhaps he's still out there, an old man now, remembering those spring nights in 1946 when he held an entire town hostage to terror and got away with it completely. If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't vanish into the darkness without hitting that like button. Share your scariest experience in the comments below, because your story might be featured next. And remember, the scariest thing is missing out. So subscribe now, before the next nightmare finds you.